the Kame House lobby with the 2MK team. This is a neither stays on US East Coast 2 lobby. You can find us in Ring Match Priority Lobby 02 in front of Kame House. You're looking for me, Rillian, a red hit avatar. And the passcode is 2717. This is mostly beginner-ish lobby. We will be talking a bit about today, specifically how to judge the timing for the use of your assists and so on, as well as obviously looping over some stuff we've said on the previous streams. We expect to have a little bit less to talk about this week specifically. Once again, we spent a lot of time working on other bots, units, and so on, and we don't really expect as much from the DBFZ side to have been shifted for most people. But there have been some particular things the team specifically wants to address and try to work on, so that'll definitely get mentioned, putting me in more so the spotting position, at least for a bit.
諸君、ごきげんよう。貴様の攻撃など、私にとっては蚊に刺されたようなものさ。 さて、スピードは自信なんだ。
あの時とは違うぞ。どうした？これが相手だ。どこへ行くぞ。何なんだ。修行の成果を見せて。
楽しめそうね。行くぞ。そこでとってもあなたはどんな味がするのかしら。僕も加勢します。ここだ。行くぞ。怪我をしても知らないわよ。まだよ。冗談じゃない。ここだ。
なんだ、俺も結構やるじゃん。危ねえ。油断しないように気をつけねえとな。
Big question on how to get proper benefits in the neutral game. This is something that comes up quite often in all games, but in Dragon Ball it feels a little different than most. First of all, because the neutral game itself feels different than other things. If you've watched mid-high level Dragon Ball, there's, as we mentioned last week, a lot of staying at full screen, jumping back a lot, jumping straight up a lot, looking for the moment to super dash because you don't want to stand too close to your opponent. You're not generally playing neutral too much with buttons, but you can do this. It's just that most people don't like risking it because of the moves they have available to them or the specific assists they've chosen to play. Sometimes your assists are much better at helping you keep up pressure when you've made the correct judgment or get out of pressure, but aren't so good at helping you play neutral in any way. When two players of this type face off, things usually get a little bit silly in the sense of neutral itself. It looks unlike what most people would expect, it has a rhythm that is very counterintuitive if you've played a lot of other games. And that's what I mean by silly. It doesn't look realistic. Even for Dragon Ball, which is a game which tends to be very true to the lore, tends to give you that feeling of, I'm doing Dragon Ball things, if you've ever watched the show. That particular form of neutral, even though it is technically decent, floating around, watching each other, whipping things, due to the lower number of characters that have straight forward beams or straight cross-screen attacks, and the fact that most characters don't just float in the air and fly, means that the neutral itself feels a little strange. Still, for quite a few characters, both stand medium and stand heavy are completely functional methods of attempting this. The issue is mainly that you have to space them so well, and, of course, that given the whole jump back option, the opponent is more likely to get into the air and possibly even dash forward to try to attack you. This is one of the most important uses of your assists if you want to play neutral. To recognize when the opponent's going into the air in order to evade your button on the ground means that it's time to hit your assist quickly in order to get them out of their air approach. Some other times you reverse the two. Your character is better at hitting them when they are coming in, but the assist is good at playing neutral, acting as a heavy button, pushing them back, and so on. So it really comes down to, in a lot of tight situations, which of your assists is available, and which of your moves you want to use. Trunks, for example, has two specific ways he can do it in the Krillin matchup. Sorry, in the matchup when he has Krillin beside him. Normally, Trunks is paired with characters who both have slightly pressury supers, and he is standing to do most of the defense. But in this case, the assists and supers are loved by both Gohan and Krillin don't necessarily give him a lot of pressury space, meaning that he has to use their movements very carefully, and therefore he must often use his own more pressury moves, such as Change the Future, in conjunction with this. Change the Future works well as not necessarily a footsie tool, but a good way to go along with Krillin's rock throw assist. Whereas, in the other situation, where he has Gohan's assist available, Trunks is more so likely to either hit a button or go for his own overhead, as the opponent will be watching for Gohan's approach. Timing these two things together can be quite hard, especially if you're not confident in the fact that your opponent is actually going to move yet, or aren't too familiar with the startup of assist calls. Meaning this becomes a part of your move set that you have to think about very differently than most other aspects of the character. Most of the time you learn the character by their moves, how their moves flow together, and similar things, but pulling together your team means understanding when your assists are available and how to utilize them specifically. But each time you think about this, it's a little different. Trunks has the options of Gohan's move, his assist, and Krillin's move. But this isn't universal. As soon as you switch to Gohan, now you've got Trunks and Krillin, but you no longer have the Gohan style assist. You may be able to do the assist as a move, and often this is quite helpful. But many of these moves are less safe when not done in assist form, and start up slowly enough that you'd want to be able to stay in a defensive stance, which you can't always do when you are playing the point character. Understanding how to do this, both in neutral and out of it, is super important, but the neutral version tends to get overlooked somewhat. We mostly see people try to rely on either pressure, landing one really long attack that they know will be perfectly spaced, or some relatively suppressive assist to help them cover space and get in. Many of the other types of assists in the game that just hit the opponent once or twice can't always be spaced to be super useful in this way, and can be harder to use as a result. Many times you're working on how to make the opponent behave or react differently using this in order to resolve your problem. Though Just Fine's assists often are used in a more suppressive way to keep the opponent in a particular space, make them unable to get away, it's not really necessary to use them like that. This is particularly true because of the difficulty in playing neutral many of her characters have. Their stand heavy tend to be a little bit strange in one way or another. But one thing they are really good at doing along with their assist instead of doing stand heavy is actually to super dash, as the opponent becomes unable to use 2H against these attacks when the assist has just been called in order to allow the super dash to happen. This is not likely to open your opponent up, though. You have to have a plan for what happens after the super dash in a specific way in order to come out on top of this. Meaning that Nappa doesn't benefit as much as Cell and Vegeta do, as both of them have lots of different options for it. But since each of them has the capacity to call the other to set this up, and also, as just shown, to simply change it into a Dragon Rush situation instead, it's a little bit easier to handle these things. Mostly, therefore, it is possible to somewhat walk down the opponent, knowing that as soon as you call the assist, you're likely to be able to super dash. In the worst case scenario, you do just get to use certain of their EX moves or supers to shift the situation around, and if you really found it didn't go well, it didn't set up the way you wanted, if you've got a lot of meter, you can even use the super to put back in the same character that you just got and resolve the problem that way. This sort of thing makes the opponent much more likely to actually approach, which is where she excels, defending in those positions, using meter to check their approaches, and generally make them miserable in other ways. With characters who have invincible moves, even Dragon Rush directly after they have forced to block Super Dash is relatively easy to deal with. Even though Dragon Rush teching has a couple conditions on it, most of the time invincible moves or certain supers will resolve the situation for you, and you can just jump out of grounded Dragon Rushes in the first place, so it's not really something that people spend a lot of time worrying about.
It's time to face your opponent! Are you ready?
Cells placed in this team, along with the new addition of Android 21, actually offers Brawly very similar options. He doesn't really tend to need a lot of help with the Super Dash, but sometimes it's a little clearer that he will get something if he has one of them to guard as he goes in, particularly after a scramble where he really wants to just Super Dash again immediately and not give the opponent any moment to come forward. The same thing goes for 21 actually. One of the first things that you want to do in a scramble when you have an assist like Cell, until you're much better at the game, is just call Cell. Just call Cell as soon as you've been knocked away and you don't know what else to do. Because it means that no matter what your opponent does, most of the time, if they want to hit you to stay in, they have to give up some meter, they have to push in a way that they don't normally expect, and you can minimize the damage done to you at other times. It's also generally a case where Cell will recharge so quickly that you don't have to care too much about it. This helps you to conserve your own meter, set up situations that you don't have to worry as much in, and keep your general flow going forward, even if you don't actually advance on the opponent. Make sure that they don't pin you down by just using this and forcing them to put more effort into sticking to you at particular times. Cell himself plays neutral so well in most situations that he doesn't really need assists to help him too much. But we've discussed before that he's not a character that manages easily when he manages to get an air-to-air hit. He doesn't have a lot of really good conversions there. Having some grounded assists along with him to help him keep this going, or as you've just seen, assist him with his Vanish, can really pick up the pace of Cell's offense since the opponent is more than likely going to try to capitalize on the fact that he doesn't convert that round in the air and stay there to prevent themselves from taking too much damage. And as always, once your assists are gone, you really are depending purely on your physical execution skill with your particular character, but that's the thing you should already have. Playing neutral without assists can be quite hard when your opponent has their own available, but your general hope is that they've lost at least one character and the double-sided aspect of it has disappeared.
This should be a great fight. Are you ready?
スーパーサイヤ人の壁、その先を俺はさらに超えてしまった。世界もみんなの笑顔も俺が守ってみせる。
Brace yourself for the coming battle! It's all or nothing! Fight!
せいぜい楽しませてくれよ。
This method of using the cell assist to cover yourself in scrambles is particularly strong against defensive players because it messes with a ton of their perspective on where you are in the match and what you're trying to do. Anything that forces such a player to completely ignore their standard natural timing is more likely to make them mashy or stressed out about one thing or another, meaning that they really can't defend. It's often in their best interest to just spam deflect rather than actually trying to hit you, or spam vanish to try to get out of the way. Most games do not have this capacity where you are actually looking out for something on the screen other than the actual attacking character, and it can really stress out people who don't have a particularly strong grasp on multi-vector attacking or little spatial things. There's really nothing to be done about this from their side. They just have to convert the mash out instinct into something else until they feel more comfortable in some other way.
A fierce showdown is about to begin.
This week in zoning play, we're looking at one specific aspect that Goku Black allows a little better than most characters. He's particularly strong at backdashing in and out of position, in that he's really good at actually forward dashing directly after a backdash and getting stuff out of that. Goku is also good at this, but Goku has a little bit more limitation and often has to use one of his moves to actually achieve the same thing. Fortunately, he has really good moves for the purpose, but it is a little bit harder than just expecting to be able to forward dash without worrying about the forward dash itself. Jiren is particularly limited in this because he doesn't really have a stand heavy. However, he can use his specials in the same space, especially his light rush. And this can save him from a lot of similar situations. But in this particular case, Goku Black has one of the largest advantages in this team, because not only does he have long forward attacks if he needs to use them, he also has both the assists of Goku and Jiren without any of the weaknesses that come from being his own character, so to speak. Jiren, for example, has a hole, and then he has two assists that do the same thing, neither of which directly fill it. Goku almost has the same options, but he has to move forward in a different way than Goku Black, and doesn't get the same things. Goku Black can generally do this more or less perfectly, as long as he has both assists, and even when he doesn't have both, one of them is usually enough that he can cover the rest himself, just at a slightly higher risk.
showdown is about to begin.
In the end, part of the reason we continue to consider this a beginner lobby is that we don't necessarily go through the ladder of things you need to learn for Dragon Ball, other than to play in these lounges, which is more of application of everything. And since we talk about a different thing every week, we're constantly switching in terms of what is available to understand and be focused on. Fortunately, the game does not require super difficult execution, but since it is constantly shifting this in terms of strategy and making you think a lot more about why you want to do things, rather than are you doing them correctly, your life is quite hard until you've realized it's fine to just repeat the same thing over and over. Similar to our moments with Dead or Alive early on, where it was difficult to recognize you could just block for long periods. Even though it's a 3D game, even though it feels as if blocking can be rougher than most, there are a lot of situations where you could just block really long. In general, if you feel like you're being overwhelmed by what this game requires of you, you should probably spend some time watching some videos on YouTube, not of how to play it, but of how other people play it, and spend more time thinking about what they really spend a lot of time doing. Combos are super important for this game simply because you spend so much time trying to convert and keep advantages from neutral situations. A strong example is actually recognizing when you have corner guard as an available option, either because of the knockdown you used or the fact that your opponent is out of meter. It is actually really hard to get out of the corner when you have no meter in this game. It may not seem so at first because you could just do certain moves, and many moves are relatively safe, but actually managing to find the right moment to hit those things and not just try to vanish or use something slow adds a level of challenge that most people can't get around, at least, forcing them to push themselves into strange situations. And remember that corner guard can definitely be active enough that you just benefit from it even though your opponent is in fact doing moves that are relatively active and you have to watch out for. Defense is a strong part of corner guarding, and therefore really strong defensive players have a massive advantage when the opponent is in the corner without meter because they get to poke at them for a very long time, often getting relatively large conversions into big enough damage that you just have the opponent ready to use that meter to try to get back out as soon as possible. While you can't necessarily do much against the vanish, if you can fake it, you can probably do a lot more damage even then. The opponent often doesn't get put back into the corner, but depending on your particular characters and your skill, you can get around it and manage to put them back there.
This should be a great fight.
Because this game is so active, and because it presents such a massive number of situations to the player, it's very hard to actually keep track of the things going on in real time, as most of them are not related to the specifics of the fighting. I.e., this game is heavily made up of situations that are hard to understand, rather than situations that are easy to deal with or counterable. There are a bunch of things in this game where you are basically assured to be at a huge enough disadvantage that you're going to get hit, or you're going to end up pushed into a situation your opponent likes just as much. Part of the reason for each character's strength in this situation is related to directly that. And the growth that we often see comes from that factor. Each player here tends to have a specific situation that they can set up that no one else generally escapes from. The rest of their game might not be as strong, but you can still learn something from having to deal with that constantly. A good example is the Nadakon's strength, without a doubt on every single other player in that you see in our lounges, is that if you have to block a crouching low, you are stuck. If you cannot react in time to outright stop this crouching low, chances are somewhere in the myriad of options, assists, meter, character strength, you're not getting out of this. And since it's more or less an unavoidable situation no matter what you do, you have to deal with it. If one can avoid getting hit by this, damage takes a lot longer to rack up, but you can't really keep that up indefinitely. Or you'd have to have a very strong plan as to how to never get hit by lows ever. And in this case, we're specifically referring to never get touched by the low. You cannot just go, I'm never going to get hit and get opened up by the low, because getting touched by it is just about the same as getting opened up, it just takes longer.
This should be a great fight.
Similarly, DeWolf's management of the timing for Super Dash and assist help to get in using it means that you have to put a lot of effort into making sure you don't get caught in that mix-up. Having mix-up style characters from the Super Dash helps even more.
Are you ready? Fight it out!
And finally, managing to hold just fine still long enough to actually force neutral is borderline impossible. Once again, partially because of the characters being used, and partially because that's just the strength of the player. Since most of your attacks will hit at times you might not be expecting them to, you can never be completely confident in your conversions, except if it's the same sort of low touch that Natacon does, in order to make sure that, okay, this I know how to work from, this I know exactly how this works. For the rest of the time, you're basically hoping and living on a prayer that whatever you hit will actually not get countered in some way, and if it doesn't get countered, that you can recognize what has happened enough to actually land a combo. But building up one's style means understanding how to take your strength and multiply it into other strengths. And that can take a while in a game this complex. Similarly, understanding exactly which two things are facing off at any given time helps you understand both the players and their game plans. This is particularly true in terms of how meter is used, as the easiest way to progress your own ability to win is to simply use your meter to counter your opponent's strength. Or you can try to find a way to counter it in some other form at least some of the time, and save some of your meter for augmenting your strength. But with strengths, of course, constantly come weaknesses, and with each of those weaknesses is something that also interacts with the opponent in various ways. Perfect defense and constant movement comes with the requirement that your opponent always has a possibility of getting an opening through using something unconventional, or just being relentless enough about their offense, using their resources or specials. Being relentless about super dashing means that when you do slip up, your opponent can basically just mash 2H until it works, and get a big combo on you. And constantly aiming for the low touch makes you particularly susceptible to backdash Dragon Rush. Fortunately, this is usually on a character who can just uppercut, but backdash, forward dash, block, all of those things are just as effective. Oni Rabbit's strong standing defense means that he's often susceptible to more sedate lows, and when those are not the thing he's worried about, you get dragon rushes. Understanding which one to do at any given time is a little bit hard, but it's still a clear weakness in relatively many situations.
この痛みがまた俺を強くする。悪くない攻撃だった。あざになるかもな。
Face your opponent! Get ready!
As you see here, without the specific timing and comfort in when to use 2H, it's very difficult to stop anything the wolf plans to do. Hitting it too early or just mashing it will often lead to you getting hit, but it's relatively hard to react to at least some of the things done, especially if you're spending a lot of time standing still, waiting for the opponent to move into a particular position. Meaning you have to be at least somewhat proactive and think through it. But it's more so about thinking than about reaction, which is something that often feels uncomfortable. Since Just Mine's characters are also not so great at the aerial 2H to solve the problem, it means that their aerial intercepts of super dashes take a different response and even more thought.
Brace yourself for the coming battle! Are you ready? Go!
俺が行く。行くぞ。終わりだわ。行くぞ。その程度か。頼む。行くぞ。終わりだ。トライ。フライ。
任せてください。
あんな
下がってよ。
この攻撃だ。
どうということはない。こっちだ。見えている。
あんまにやって
その程度か。
ういなんと無様な姿か。今オラの出番だ。まだまだよっよっ
今度は俺が相手です。
全力で来い。来い。
やってみせる。
行くぞ。終わりだわ。
As you can see, a lot of this is about learning to read your opponent's rhythm or get used to them, which actually means that, of course, professional players who must face many potentially unknown opponents on their path to the tournament victory have to train a lot harder to do this much faster. Understanding an opponent within a few interactions is very important in games like this, particularly those where they may have not just characters you don't see often, but combinations of characters you don't see often, leading to new tactics that you're not necessarily familiar with. Not all of these tactics are optimal, but if the player has put enough time into them, you may get basically surprised, even if they're not necessarily playing what you'd expect to be the best team or the best method for playing such a team. If they've come up with a specific way to use something that you have not seen before, and they read your rhythm before you can read theirs, you can end up in a world of hurt.
It's all or nothing. Fight!
Raleigh, on the other hand, as mentioned many times, the character is literally built to get to Super Dash. Assist or not, even his projectile moves a little slower, just enough that, you know, if you're really dedicated to it, you end up feeling a little strange about trying to hit the 2H exactly when you need to hit it. And at some ranges, there isn't really a specific time you should hit it either, because he can delay a bunch of things and otherwise stress you out as well. One decent option is of course to simply deflect his projectile, as it has so much startup, and once you get used to doing that, it's relatively trivial to actually do. The other option is to use your assist to cover the space so that the projectile is stopped by the assist or absorbed by it hitting them, and then you still have time to anti-air Brawly correctly.
なんだと届き物が逃がす俺は相手だ
こっちだ。
The interaction makes this matchup very complicated, as it's very difficult for the offensive player to be sure that they should be going on offense right then. But similarly, the defensive player must backdash so much that eventually they run out of space to backdash into. Therefore, it's often in Amara's best interest to just build up as much space as possible, so as to be able to backdash into it. By definition, Nutakon's combos are almost impossible to counterattack, meaning that once you get touched, you just have to defend until he runs out of assists or something is over. It's really mostly not your turn for a very long time, and if you are in the corner, it just never becomes your turn again functioning. Hence the high requirement of the backdash to avoid that situation ever even starting. Fortunately, one strong advantage of zoning characters is that if the opponent is not aware enough, that whole backdash is really not stopping you from launching your attacks at all. Although in many cases, Goku does need to do TK or instant jump beams in order to prevent certain clashes from happening or avoid the opponent's attacks. If life drops low enough, Raw Vanish becomes a real threat again, taking away even more of the options in those spaces and forcing it down to, do I have enough space to backdash into?
The battle's about to start. Good luck.
初めから全力でかかってくるんだな。
まずお前から血祭りにあげてやる。来い！楽しめそう。なんなんだ？
負けないわよ。まだおいで。こっちよ。まだよ。終わりよ。冗談じゃない。相手だ。負けないわよ。負けないわよ。まだどうだ。逃がさないぞ。どうだ。お願い。なんの。
任せてください。
どうした？完全体だ。この
怪我しても知らないわよ。
これでも食らえ。
負けないわよ。
やってみせる。
こっち。こんなこともできるのよ。
やってみせる。
こんなところで。
誤算だったな。世界もみんなの笑顔も俺が守ってみせる。
It's time to face your opponent.
This makes for an interesting situation in the matchup between high defense and that unrelenting sticky offense. Since Just Fine's team does not really have a way to easily make sure, with all the beams and so on, that Nutacon never lands that hit, the question becomes, how long can she defend against it? And if she defends against it for long enough, what happens? With all assists active, very long-term defense means that she basically doesn't take any damage for long periods of time, and that eventually, if things get complicated, the assist will handle the spacing. This drags out this match all to almost interminable lengths, but slowly gives Nutacon the resource advantage. The problem being that if he must use that meter to build back up offense, it's not really an advantage after all. Making this a huge test of patience mentally to both players. In other words, as long as Justine has enough faith in her timing for assists, recharging, and general defense, it still takes too long to wear her down in the general sense, except when corner carry happens or similar, meaning that the best thing to do is focus as much as possible on getting out of it and waiting for that moment, as mentioned before, where the opponent is somehow cornered with no meter of their own. This is unlikely to happen, except if she plays defensively long enough to force the meter to be used on Nutacon's offense. Without the meter, it's difficult for your Teen Gohan to do a ton of damage. So it's less likely that certain characters are going to just get deleted also. However, moments like that, going in, requires that Justine have a very clear idea of how she intends to do this, because otherwise she's giving Nutacon an opportunity to use meter and build it up, with no benefit to her really. However, on the other hand, her strong ability to defend for extremely long periods means that building up blue health after large amounts of damage is done can actually be a full-on strategy here. Another helpful part when it comes to denying Nutacon the use of resources, as he often needs to use it to keep making sure he gets something like a Dragon Rush, but even this is hard to land.
神の力を見るがいい。落ちろ。神の力を見るがいい。神の力を見るがいい。この攻撃ならやばい。切った。
This factor of Goku Black's playstyle means that he is one of the characters that has the highest amount of mix-ups when playing on point with 2 strong assists behind him on the dash-up, as dash-up block is one of his better options. He doesn't need to do anything at that spacing for it to be a good idea. That would be the main difference between him and Goku. Whereas Goku Black has a bunch of stuff he can do instantly out of the air that does not take too long and spaces him differently. Goku lacks at least some of this and has to worry more about what happens when he dashes up on an opponent and just blocks in front of them. This is absolutely not a game where you should spend too much time worrying about taking hits, because it's not as simple as I took a hit so a bad thing is happening. You want to make sure that if you are taking a hit, that it is just a hit that you don't care about, which is relatively easy to set up a lot of the time. There are a lot of hit situations in this game where you don't care. For example, even this is not necessarily a hit you care about, because you're just going to sparking it, recover it. The opponent only has 1 character, so you don't have to worry too much about what they're doing, and so on. Even this situation is again in your favor, as the opponent now has no meter and has to deal with Goku Black and the force that he can put behind certain things without any assist to back him up either. Another useful interaction we have. Hitting with the low is harder when your opponent is constantly either super dashing, putting a projectile in front of them, or just calling assists that are good at covering the space. This is probably the most important matchup for the whole call cell to cover things after a scramble, as once you get touched, these characters are not good at all at getting away from the pressure that comes with this team. Brawly thankfully doesn't really care a whole lot about what happens when he does get hit out of a super dash, unless you are ready with the 2H. Once a player has mastered the specifics of movement for Brawly, you can actually get messed up quite a lot because the spacings he ends up at is slightly different than other characters in terms of the super dash, meaning that you'd feel as if you're about to hit the ground when you haven't yet. Both Brawly's size and some of the moves he does make this feel a little bit different than other characters. Fortunately, the style of play builds up a lot of meter on the other side, meaning one big combo conversion can really shut him down. He tends to be a lot more vulnerable, a lot easier to push back. And once a good conversion comes, we know how Team Gohan rolls. If you have been touched, I will get to do the maximum damage. This is not a character where you have to worry a lot about, was it my chance to convert or not? He definitely does have quite a few relatively complex conversions, but he doesn't generally have the ambiguity that some other characters have in terms of whether or not he can do them. On the other side, Android 21 is absolutely a master of the, okay, I don't have a lot of combo to do here, but I'm gonna hit you a couple of times and get you off me. She does decent damage while doing this too, which is why we were slightly confused that she's more so of a weird zoning character by most people's standards, and ended up in one of our Super Dash defense bots. Primarily because once she does Super Dash in, she gets to maintain those longer positions, and you can't really just approach her, meaning she gets to reposition herself for another Super Dash fairly quickly, along with Yamcha, who is also in that bot.
This should be a great fight!
This team's trying to split between sticking to you from the air and some long-range control. The long-range control part, however, doesn't necessarily work that well on Jiren or on other characters of that type, because they can generally spend much time further away from you and use either deflect or parry to deal with their situations. Kame is much more of a threat, as his move is not a matter of watching anything other than where he is on the screen, but that's a general trait of this team as a whole. You don't really need to watch the space between you and them because they can't generally cross it in time. Your general goal, therefore, is to just watch whatever they are doing and wherever they are. In certain cases, however, jumping out of the way is not as viable as against other characters, meaning that you don't get to avoid their attacks by assuming they have to come in on the ground, or even assuming they're going to super dash. They have too many other options in those positions. This can be very disconcerting in a lot of spaces, forcing you to either continue to backdash, similar to dealing with the lows, even though it doesn't feel as if you should need to, or making you feel as if you have the 2H, but most of the time you will be baited into doing the 2H at the wrong time anyway. Once your best option is to be far away, obviously, therefore, you backdash a bit when you feel uncomfortable and watch the opponent. Since they have so many advancing moves that you cannot check yourself, you might as well, once you've been attacked, attempt to backdash then as well. They have just enough range to dash up and do things to you, and otherwise stress you out. Leaving your neutral jump timing to be more so about a scramble, as you're often pushed far enough apart that the neutral jump will actually work, or at least minimize the damage you take from anything they choose to do immediately.
Vegeta, win!
その痛み決して忘れるな。
A fierce showdown is about to begin! Get ready! Fight it out!
This matchup shifts quite a lot, depending primarily on whether or not Nutacon is attempting to get in to pressure enough to go for the Dragon Rush or not. While Omni Rabbit does often actually manage to defend from the Dragon Rush in pressure, it still causes enough of a shift mentally that the other methods of getting in start to work. Maintaining that defense and checking Nutacon's various approaches are therefore the key to this whole thing. Omni Rabbit being one of the few players that basically has to let Nutacon do this, but sitting fairly decent on at least one character who can survive this purely because they just have an invincible move to get out of it at least a little bit. And as we've discussed on previous streams, Videl does open you up, but she does nearly no damage when she's doing it. Meaning you have to be far more concerned with whether or not she's carrying you to the corner than whether or not she opens you up at all. This is particularly true with King Gohan because trying to jump out of the way or having any interactions with him in that way allows him to actually start combos and get in. Your best bet isn't that to just sit tight on the ground and not put yourself at massive risk. He can eventually open you up, and this does help him build meter, which is a problem. But just know that generally going into the air against King Gohan at the timings where your opponent set up the situation is probably just looking to die. Having Adult Gohan's assist, however, is an even better counter to the situation, even now that he can't actually be called during block stun. Because you can use him as yet another method of checking the opponent's offense without having to worry about opening yourself up. And if you happen to swap him in by accident or just have him in for a little while, you're still not really in any danger because once again, if it worse comes to worse, just uppercut. The stickiness of this team has a lot more to do with your ability to block for long periods and the strong synergy that blocking for long periods gives, in that Team Gohan will end up with enough meter to delete most of your team without too much effort. But put real pressure on him to use this meter, or even just space out his attacks so that he doesn't end up running out of meter trying to keep up pressure, and you probably will find your opening. From Nodokon's side, therefore, it's mostly about getting in and then going for something unconventional. Either a slow jumping normal, potentially crossing up, or just going for the raw Dragon Rush, because generally all that will happen is that it will get teched, which either pushes the opponent more toward the corner or allows the assist to be called directly at the end to start once again. It also obviously buys a lot of time for assist recharges, and the opposing assists are not that threatening.
Time to begin the match!
So similar to the Notacon setup, this is about buying yourself as much space as possible and backdashing into that space whenever you don't know what else to do or feel uncomfortable. The strong zoning options available, though, make it even easier. Beating these characters in either footsies or pseudo footsies is next to impossible, so just get out the way. All of the characters on this team have a strong method to do this. Even Jiren can technically do this in a specific way that isn't really the same as the others, but still fairly functional. As the main goal, especially when pushed to the corner, is mostly to get over your opponent's head and not so much worry about doing anything else. Goku can do this with his medium Tatsu and assume that the opponent, even if they clip him, are not going to do too much damage because he just intercepts them in the air. Goku Black has his own way as well. And Jiren, interestingly, can just jump and do his down blast, stopping the opponent from approaching in a particular way long enough for him to super dash, which is not something most characters can do. Similarly, often when you're in that situation where you really feel the need to get out of the corner or whatever with Jiren, it's a decent time to actually set up to call one of the other characters to do their super dash in case you get hit. Because if you do, most likely they'll manage the escape. Jiren is much harder to push back, therefore you're more likely to have had time to recharge your assist while that was going on. But as with all of Classic Dynasty's characters, intercepting them is a massive exercise in strong execution, meaning that until you have had a lot of time to practice it, doing it any other way is generally looking to get beat up. This builds into her style of occasionally just pausing and not attacking at all, which lures many players into moving toward her, but generally she's completely prepared for this, and with extremely long normals that convert well into combos, it's unlikely you're going to get anywhere with any conventional approach. Jiren at least has the advantage of being able to use his shield-style charge at relatively long range, and it will stop a lot of things that the opponent does, but in this situation it's still more or less the fact that he had to backdash first or be willing to get out of the situation by backdashing rather than by trying to hit the opponent.
Get ready for a Dragon Ball Rumble! It's all or nothing! Let's go!
終わりにしてやる。許さんぞ。
かかってきな。来てくれ。
行きますよ。これが俺の全力です。俺が相手だ。よっしゃ。大丈夫ですか？終わりにしてやる。
死にたくなければ避けろ。
俺が相手だ。
ハイキック。アドだ。アドだ。来てくれ。せい。だ。せい。行くぞ。聞こう。
参ったこれから見せるのが本当の力だ。やってくれる。
逃がさんぞ。
この
せい。行くぞ。聞こう。
これで終わりです。
そうだ。そこか。
ありがとうございました。ありがとうございました。僕もっと頑張ります。
It's time to face your opponent! Ready? Let's go!
これならどうだ。俺を信じろ。よくもコケにしてくれたな。またなめんじゃねえ。なんと無様なコケだ。こんなもんか。なんだ終わりじゃねえか。よくもコケにしてくれたな。あんなおっ逃がす。逃がす。
どっちだ。そこだ。そこだ。
受けるがいい。
落ちるよ。
するな。そんなもんかよ。そんなもんかよ。終わりだ。まあまあだな。素晴らしい。
俺が行く。
そんなもんかよ。絶対に許さねえ。
行くぞ。こう。いいか。
なめんじゃねえ。
その程度か。見えている。
これ譲ってやるか。
頼む。聞かせてもらう。無駄だ。そこだ。こんなものか。ファイナルスペシャル。どけ、俺が行く。その程度か。行くぞ。終わりだわ。こっちだ。
また。なかなかやるじゃん。これならどうだ。
俺が行く。
そんなもんかよ。
その程度か。
やるじゃねえか。
来い。なんで。わからん。
オラが相手だ。負けんじゃねえぞ。そんなもんかよ。また。この肉体は素晴らしいぞ。ほっ。まあまあだな。受けるがいい。笑いやれば。
調子に乗るな。その体はな、細胞の隅々まで。そうだ。
驚き者が。素晴らしいぞ。
逃がさんぞ。
嘘だ。
Get ready for a Dragon Ball Rumble! Are you ready? Fight it out!
今の時危ないじゃない。させない。よし、フランス大丈夫か。さあ行こうよ。ご飯によし。まだやる気
なの？何なの？
待たせたな。生きた。やばい。くだ。出直してくるんじゃない。
任せてください。やってみせる。
生きた。生きた。
この攻撃から生きた。やージュリーさん。行くぞ。やー終わらせてやる。バーン上量で
無理するんじゃないぞ。
見えてるぞ。見えてるぞ。まだまだ。よっ。13ぞ。お願いします。見えてるぞ。
死にたくなければよけろ。
覚悟しなさい。これで終わりよ。フィニッシュ。まだやる気なの？お願い。今だ。しまった。やーさあ、行くわよ。これでも行くわよ。やー
下がっている。
あんまりやって。
大丈夫？
まだまだ。よっ。
大丈夫。
今度は俺が相手です。
修行の成果を見せてやるな。なんだ。いっぱい飛ばすぞ。
何をしている。メカ。やばい。
なんだ。
行くぞ。何をする気だ。チャンス。おのれ。
任せて。
甘い。
飛ばすぞ。やばい。
今度は俺が相手です。この攻撃から
バカめ。いい勝負だった。感謝するぞ。これが俺の修行の成果だ。
手だ。またまた落ちろ。大丈夫か。ハンナー落ちろ。君の力を見るがいい。まあまあだな。
下がっている。
油断してたぜ。
行くぞ。ビッグバン悪は滅びる。トライ。来い。そうだ。甘い。ビッグバンどうということはない。終わりだ。こっちだ。行くぞ。
これなら
目玉だ。来い。点数をつけるとすれば目玉だ。どうということはない。調子に乗るな。
驚き者が孫悟空。驚く。
下がっている。いやいやもったか。次は助け。悪は滅びる。なんだ。見えている。調子に乗るな。調子に乗る。
これならどう驚き者がハンナ驚き者がオラが相手だ。ナイスティアント。
茶番は終わりだ。邪魔だ。一気に終わらせる。その程度か。終わりだわ。
叫んじゃねえぞ。
行くぞ。行くぞ。
よくもここにしてくれたな。
どうということはない。見えている。いやいやもったか。なんだ。
終わりじゃねえか。
甘い。行くぞ。
遅いぜ。
落ちろ。
こんなもんかよ。
俺が破れるだと。
見ろよ。俺が変えてみせる。てめえらと出来が違うんだよ、出来が。 どうした
配球権
Counter!
大丈夫ですか天津飯さん
逃がさんぞ
どうした
甘い調子配球権アドだ
これで終わりです。どうだ。逃がさないぞ。どうだ。ここだ。よっ。どうだ。口だ。いや、いっぱい飛ばすぞ。どうだ。今だ。どうだ。いっぱい飛ばすぞ。よっ。すみません。
さあかかってきろ
なんの。どうだ。逃がさないぞ。
大丈夫ですかちょっとアドだ配球権逃がさんぞ行くぞ聞こう
一気に行くわよ。ビビルさん琥珀。
Falls a little short, and therefore gets lectured. Oh, not really lectured.
何をしているアドだせい行くぞ行くわよ甘い
戦いはそんなに好きじゃない。でも今は勝たないとダメな時なんだ。
やそれ行くわよ今よ今よや嘘でしょ危ないじゃないごはんくん
下がっている。
そうでしょさせない何すんのまだやる気なの
悪は絶対許せない正義の味方グレートサイヤマンだ
今それさせないこっちよ今だそれやごはんくん行くわよ今お願いよしそれでも
メハメそんなもんかよなんじゃねえまあまあだな
どうだ
当たり見えてるぞ見えてるぞ遅いぜ
そこだ。そこだ。調子に乗るな。しまった。これは俺様だ。
メハメ
死にたくなければ避けろ。するなよ。目玉だ。
ただいま参上
ビッグバンが
受けてみろ
ここを見ている。ファイナルステージ。下がっている。
そこまでだ
まだ今よしそれお願いよしせーの
そんなバカな。
ただいま参上
Adele's one of the stronger characters to deal with Kid Buu simply because she can hang in the air and still launch an attack that not only evades a lot of his stuff, but furthermore forces him to use and waste a lot of effort. This works relatively well on Bardock as well, except that she does parts of it with assists instead of by calling her built-in assist. In fact, her largest problem against these types of characters is the same as you've been seeing before. Starting offense while trying to move into their space can be a little rough. Fortunately, she can outmaneuver a lot of the things they want to do in the first place, getting behind them in various ways and solving the problem that way.
俺はもっと強く次に戦う時を楽しみにしている。
A fierce showdown is about to begin! It's all or nothing! Fight!
俺に指図するな。逃がさん。神の力を見るがいい。受けるがいい。かんな。こっちだ。行くぞ。まだまだ。孫悟空。許さんぞ。かんな。本気で行くぞ。ぬるい。逃がさず。神の力を見るがいい。不足。外しろ。
その程度か。
まだまだ。
なんだと。悪は滅びろ。トライ。聞かせてもら
まだまだ。なんて頼みます。やれ。調子に乗る。
逃がさんぞ。
逃がさん。神の力を見るがいい。不足。受けるがいい。我が刃。
どけ。俺が行く。
相手だ。行くぞ。
なんだ。
捕らえた。
どうということはない。あとは任せる。
修行の成果を見せてやるぞ。
茶番は終わりだ。行くぞ。終わりだわ。邪魔だ。落ちろ。
受けるがいい。全力で行くぞ。やるな。驚き者が俺が役べるとは。
茶番は終わりだ。どうということはない。来い。甘い。行くぞ。破れるだと。
戦いの感が鈍ってるな。大人になって一緒に戦うなんてなんだか不思議な感じですね。
fight is anybody's guess. Are you ready? Fight!
切れるほっと
下がって
それそれこっちよ何よほっとおい僕が行くだどうしたなめんじゃねえどうしたお願いしますお願いします先導絶対に許されそんなもんかよしょんほっとなめんじゃねえ悪は絶対許せない正義の味方グレートサイヤマンだ油断してた
点数をつけるとすれば30目玉だそこだ下がってよ
それそれ行くよヤバハンクや
こんなものか目玉だ点数をつけるとすれば30点ってところだ
何すんのよ何すんのよ行くよさせない僕が行くだ信じろ無駄だどうした油断してたぜなめんじゃねえそんなもんかよ
そこだ見てよそこだ
なあ
逃がすか宇宙の塵にしてやる
見てるぞ
目玉だ点数こんなものか目玉だしてくたばれ
Counter! Counter!
くそ無駄だ無駄だ自分に指図するの
どうだ見えてるぞ
下がっている
で終わりにしてやる
行くぞ聞こうこいつは犯人だいい人そこだ見えたしまった配球権崩壊するなよ点数をつける
Counter!
俺には勝てん諦めろ
TX Shinhan! Win!
お前と手合わせできたこと武道家として誇りに思う
初めから全力でかかってくるんだな。
It's all or nothing. Go!
行くぞ。終わりだわ。
俺に指図するな。孫悟空。終わりだ。
When your opponent manages to make you feel as if moving is a bad idea, it usually means that they are going to move around just a little bit to adjust their spacing perfectly. If you spend enough time playing against or watching a particular opponent, you can learn what spacing tends to quote-unquote mean which move. And, as just demonstrated, when you don't really know which one you really want to deal with, or have to deal with, one of your better options is to just vanish immediately if you think it's going to lead to some sort of mix-up or a pin down, especially if the opponent pushed you toward the corner but you're not in it quite yet. This can help you stay mid-screen and avoid certain negative situations fairly easily. Zoning characters like these have a lot of options for pushing you very far away from them very fast. But this also means that if they are mid-screen, they have just as strong corner carry as everyone else. It's just that the way their corner carry works is not so much based on sticking you there. The result of this, of course, meaning that the best person for this matchup, at least if dealing with Vidal is the goal, is actually Vegeta Blue. not specifically because he has any strong advantages against her character, but simply that he doesn't have the same weaknesses of the other two and has a bigger chance of making sure that not a lot of meter is gained in the neutral interaction. Even if it forces damage to be taken more on both sides, extra meter usage is still good.
点数をつけるとすれば30点ってところだ。
大丈夫ですか？行くわよ。それそれ。させない。それ大丈夫ですか？
サイヤ人の底力を侮るなよ。
As you can see, both their health and their meter turned out relatively even in that space for quite a while. With Vidal's health much lower now, it's much easier for Bardock and Kid Buu to run ragged or run amok as they usually do.
The outcome of this fight is anybody's guess! Ready? Fight!
俺にさせるなんだ届き者が神の力を見るがいいさっとしろやれなやれなどう よっしゃういまずいきれい行くぞまだまだよっ行くぞまだまだよっクリリンさん行くぞまだまだまずいよっ落ちろ逃がさず神の力を見るがいい落ちろおて兄ちゃん私にぬるい全国お願いします逃がさ愚かな愚かな相手だどうしようか
下がってよなんだこの威力は黙れその程度か行くぞ終わりだわ行くぞこうなんだどうということはない行くぞ終わりだわ
受けるがいい我が刃
これから見せるのが本当の力だマセ
さっとしろ
そう俺が相手だ
これならどう
しまったこっちだとっておきだ
落ちろ
いっぱい飛ばすぞ
どうということはない捕らえる行くぞ行くぞどうということはないその程度か来いバカな
今オラの出番だ
逃がさないぞ
俺が直々に相手をしてやろう
何なんだよどうだ逃がさん
こっちだ私たちからは逃げられぬ
どうだ逃がさないぞ
届き者が
修行の成果を見せてやる
私には通じん
こっちだ
受けるがいい我が刃逃がさん
神の力を見るがいいまったく貴様ら人間は何度死を軽んじれば気が済むんだ俺という存在の全てはただひたすらにここを
We are now moving toward the end of our stream. So one more look at Vegeta Blue facing off with Videl, and the tactics that often come out of that. The tournament results in a meter advantage, but rather than switching, Vegeta goes in and gets defeated by Tenshinhan, more or less negating the advantage that existed, and possibly shifting the entire way that this match will go on that one decision. We're still finalizing unit spots. We, as mentioned, expect to have Robotics Lab tomorrow rather than this guidance. However, there is a chance that it will be ready on Sunday and that the Robotics Lab will act somewhat as the disc guidance, as we have a fairly decent idea of what exactly the bot is supposed to do. Our problem is more so with the inputs. In this case, it will be Yuzu Riha. So one Yuzu bot for tomorrow. You're going to see it one way or another. Whether or not it should be released on Sunday is a different question. Next week Monday, you should be able to expect our usual mishmashing battle lounge, one form or another. And once again, the hope is to return to the Tuesday training, as there is some training that people want to get done before certain tournaments. Most tournaments are fairly far off, but you generally can't start too early when it comes to games as complex as Guilty Gear. Next week, Wednesday, we are expecting another Sandbag Casuals, though not necessarily the same player or the same topic. Bringing us back around to Thursday, another Kame house. It may not be too different from this one, depending on whether or not anyone in particular has time to poke at DBFZ bot, any of the forms. But there's not likely to be much DBFZ bot research done, as we are focusing on Unist for now. So with that final strike from Tenshinhan, we have come to the end of our Kame House lobby and stream for tonight. Join us again next week, same time, same channel. This has been Aurelian142MK. Good luck with your training, and good night, everyone.
勝負は時の運にも左右される。